to summarize. And if it doesn't go well the second time, nothing more I can do about it. It is what it is, and I have failed you, and you can dock my pay. That's fine. Just talk to one of our elders and work on that. But so what we were talking about last week is we're in the midst of Jeremiah chapter 31, which Jeremiah chapter 31, positive or negative chapter? Absolutely positive. We're in the messianic texts of Jeremiah. We're in the sections where he's talking about the future, the kingdom, the Messiah, the church, the wonderful, glorious thing that's going to happen to Israel and to Judah. But by that, he really is talking primarily about spiritual Israel, the spiritual people of God, of which we were a part of. And he was saying, he was going off of this proverb in particular, and this is where we were talking a little bit. Ezekiel in the, I believe it's the 18th chapter, talks about this proverb in great detail. It says, the fathers eat sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge. What's the meaning of the proverb that people were quoting that says the fathers eat the sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge? How would you summarize that in your own words?
The children are held responsible for the deeds of the father.
Yes, the children are suffering for the consequences of what the parents did. That's essentially what that proverb means. And so God says, hey, that proverb in the new covenant age, that is not going to be spoken of anymore. We are not going to quote that like it's something that's true that happens all the time. No, each person will be responsible for their own sins, their own consequences. And so we tried to get in a little bit of a discussion last week about, well, what did he mean when he said some of that in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Exodus? Well, I think a lot of times what it's talking about is the effects of somebody's sin. Just because the dad sins does not mean that the effects of dad's sin will not be felt to the people all around him, including to his sons and including to their sons, sometimes the third or the fourth generation. The entire people around you will feel the effects of that. The sin will visit, it will show up. Does not mean God is holding the son or the grandson guilty for those sins. Doesn't mean that. Does mean, though, that the effects will be felt. And there are a lot of things that, even though I wouldn't call it guilt in the legal sense of the term, they're very much stigmatized. They're very much going to deal with a bad reputation. And in some ways, sometimes kids or kids of kids will have to deal with some baggage in their life that is just not fair. But it's because of the reputation handed down to them. And we all deal with stuff like that. But primarily in the Old Testament, that was something that they were talking about. And he makes it clear, listen, I want to make it very clear to you in this new covenant age, you will have no reason to say that everyone will be only solely accountable for their own sins. And so we ask the question, well, hold on a second. If they weren't really and truly held accountable for anyone else's sin but their own in the old covenant anyway, how could he say under the new covenant that they're not going to quote this proverb anymore because they're not going to be held accountable for anything except their own sins? Do you understand what I'm saying? If we have established, and maybe you guys don't agree, but I really think it's true, that God really didn't hold people guilty or responsible for sins that they did not commit, even under the old covenant, then why would he say under the new covenant, we're no longer going to talk about this proverb that says God holds people guilty, they did it, but everyone else suffers. And we were trying to bounce around that. Well, that is just a springboard in my mind to talk about the differences yet again between the old and the new covenant. I just came back from Ohio with Chris Cart, with Anthony, with my family, and I was talking to a guy named George Fall up there, and we were talking about the Hebrew roots movement yet again, the idea that the old covenant is still, by and large, it's still binding today, that it just hasn't gone away, that it has just been lumped into Christianity, and it literally needs to be followed to the letter. And he said just even in this past year or so, he's encountered several other people who are really espousing that idea. It's kind of a growing thing, and he and I have been talking about it. So it's just another chance for us to remind ourselves, especially since Jeremiah is talking about it. So I like to appeal to Hebrews 8:7 because I think it's a great summation of what we're talking about. If there had been nothing wrong with the first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. If there had been nothing wrong with the first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. Well, hold on a second. One of the big things that people espouse is that they point to the Old Testament where it says God's law is perfect. God's Torah is perfect. Is that true? Is the law of God perfect? Is it? Well, yeah, it says it's true. Clearly God's law is perfect. So how could something be perfect and yet there be something wrong with it? Maybe that's the dilemma that we're struggling with here. Maybe that's what's so challenging to wrap our minds around. How can something be perfect and yet there be a problem with it? Well, maybe this is a crude example. What about Noah? How was Noah supposed to be saved from that wicked generation? What did God tell him to do? What was God's Torah to Noah? Build a giant boat. How many of you have done that to be saved? Built a giant ark. Why not, if God's perfect Torah to Noah said to build a giant ark to be saved, and he was, why have you not done it? You can tell me it's okay. Because you weren't told to do it, right? God didn't say that to you. He said that to Noah and to his family. Why? Because it was a specific situation in which that was needed. It served the purpose. It perfectly served the purpose. That was a perfect law of God, if you will, a command of God that needed to be obeyed. Same thing with the Old Covenant. It was, in fact, the perfect law of God that needed to be obeyed, but that does not mean that therefore it is universally binding for all time. It can be perfect and yet be limited. And Hebrews will talk about wills. Well, there's another good example. You might have a will that is, at the time, a perfect will. It is exactly what needs to be said in the will. But then, things change. You have surprise kids you didn't know you were going to have. Whoa, surprise income or whatever. And you tweak the will, right? You go and you amend it. You add, you create a different one. It's not saying that the first one was flawed when you came out with it, but ultimately, it did become flawed because it applied to different circumstances. So that's what we're saying with God. When God says something, it is not flawed, but sometimes it is temporary in who he's talking to. Sometimes he may only specifically be talking to a group of people or a nation because he wants them to learn an important lesson that will come into play a long time later. That's what I think he's talking about here. If there had been nothing wrong with the first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. That's what Hebrews says, and that is what is the case. So, clearly, even though it was perfect at the time, we come to a point in time where something has changed, something is given away. There has been an incompleteness that was built into this first covenant on purpose by God. Why? What was he trying to do? Well, we can see. What are the problems with the old covenant? That perfect covenant at the time still had these issues with it that God deliberately put there for them to think about. First one, animal sacrifice. What was the issue with animal sacrifice?
People still felt guilty.
Yes. People thought, if I sinned, how does it make that sin go away when I break the neck of this innocent little animal? So I spill some blood. How does that make me feel better? As a matter of fact, it kind of makes me feel worse, doesn't it? I feel like I'm just brutally murdering a creature. Their consciences, Hebrews says, were never fixed from that. And it wasn't complete. They had to do it again and again and again. Every time sin came up, or every time that they even had sacrifices for sins that may have been committed in ignorance, because they may have just missed it. They had all kinds of these things, right? So that was one of the major problems with animal sacrifice. So why did God do it? Why did God do it? Well, because he wanted us to experience that, to see that, hey, we need a good sacrifice. We need a right sacrifice. We need one that can actually, truly take care of the sin and cleanse our conscience. These animals can't do it. We can't do it. There is nothing we could possibly do on our own to take care of our sin problem. We need a perfect sacrifice. And then under the new covenant, what do we have? Jesus, deliberately called the Lamb of God. Right from the get-go, John the Baptist is yelling out, "Look, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." The perfect sacrifice. The only one that's like, yes, now that makes more sense. Someone who chose himself, God's own son, just like Abraham had a son or whatever, who chose himself to step in and say, I will take their punishment. I am perfect. I am not just human. I am God in flesh. So therefore, my sacrifice can actually pay the price. Right? So the new covenant makes that clear. The old covenant wasn't flawed accidentally. It was, if you will, temporary, flawed deliberately, if you will, because God wanted us to point to see something new, right? In the old covenant, we had a physical temple. Now, it blows my mind to see how people today hold on to this thing, but a physical temple is just not going to cut it for the entire world. I hope you can see that when you're reading through the Old Covenant. I'm in the midst of Leviticus right now. I really hope you can see that. Those of us with spots on our bald heads, not that many of us, but some of us experience that, we got to go see the priest. We need to get our checkup, our physical, by the priest to make sure we're not in violation of God's law. Those of us who own houses and we got mildew show up, we need to go get them inspected by the priest. Where are you going to find a proper priest of the line of Aaron? Well, good luck with that. But even if you do, how is that supposed to happen? How are they supposed to dwell at a physical temple in a physical location on a planet that they say has had 108 billion people living on it to this point? And one little family of priests in one temple, one building is supposed to take care of all of that somehow. It's as though it was deliberately designed not to be universal for the entire world, but to get you to see, okay, I see the makings of something, but it's clearly not big enough for everything. It's still leaving me wanting. I wonder why. I wonder what it's pointing me to. And then along comes Jesus, the Holy Spirit, through the Apostle Paul, talks about, this is in numerous places, how we are a temple of God. We together, God's people, the church, are his holy temple. And then we're reminded about the New Testament, the new Jerusalem, that heaven that we're going to experience with God, and how there is no temple there. Because there again, God's already got it. His own people. That's where he dwells. He doesn't need a physical house in that new place. And yet there's so many theologies out there trying to say that no, there's a physical temple going to be rebuilt. And when they say that, they're saying the animal sacrifices are going to be resumed too. Neither of which makes any sense. Now, this is the one, feel free to disagree with me, but I'm gonna argue for it. Original sin. I know this from the New Covenant, reading the book of Romans. I may not get it very well from the Old Covenant, but because of what Romans says, in Romans chapter 5 in particular, I believe if you study that passage carefully, you will see that there is a such thing as original sin through Adam. I believe there is a such thing as an inherited guilt of some kind that we got from Adam. Not just consequences, but some sort of guilt. I couldn't tell you specifically what it was because I don't think the Bible goes into great detail on it, but there is some sort of thing, some sort of guilt that we did inherit from Adam, but it does not stop there. Under the New Covenant, you keep reading and studying Romans 5 and you realize when Jesus came, his sacrifice nullified, it wiped out that original sin. It did away with that original guilt. And now all that's left is our own choice, our own, and the way people have always been saved is by faith. Faith is the only thing that saves you. Your faith put into Christ, put into God, right? So what I'm saying is if I am correct in my understanding of Romans 5, if you didn't have Jesus, you'd be stuck with original sin. If Jesus never showed up, then we would be stuck with the sin of Adam, even if we lived a perfect life the rest of our life. What Adam did, apparently, according to Romans, transferred to us too. And then maybe the Catholics would be right, except you can't baptize it away. You can't just make it disappear. There is nothing you can do to take care of original sin. One of the reasons why I'm partial to that is because under the Old Covenant, they were still quoting this proverb, the fathers eat sour grapes, the children's teeth are set on edge. How could they quote that meaningfully? Well, if they had even the slightest bit of understanding about the sin that may have been inherited through Adam, and knowing that without a Messiah, we can't get rid of it, then it's very fair to say we're all in trouble because of what happened a long time ago with our forefathers. That may not be the correct way to interpret this passage. This is my opinion I'm sharing with you guys here. But I just want to argue for it because when Jesus came and died, he did nullify that proverb very specifically. The fathers eat the sour grapes, the children's teeth are set on edge. Jesus flattened that, and it's gone. There is no baby, no child, no mentally deficient person that is guilty of anything anymore, right? That's gone because Jesus took care of it with what we will call original grace by his sacrifice on the cross. Now all that's left is for anyone who's mentally able to understand what sin is, they are going to be held responsible for it. Where there is no law, there's no transgression, there's no guilt of sin. But when there's the understanding, and when you see, and when I say law, I don't just mean, Old Ten Commandments or New Testament, John 3:16 kind of stuff. I mean, looking out at creation and seeing, wow, sure looks like some powerful being made this. Or when you think about your conscience and you realize, man, I don't feel like I'm perfect. I feel like I'm good. Those are the kind of laws that we're talking about, right? Well, where that doesn't exist, I don't believe you're going to be held accountable for sins. If you're mentally, you can't do that. But you will be if you look out at that, because Jesus leveled the playing field. He is the second Adam. He's greater. I was trying to argue for that last week. You don't have to believe it, but I think it explains the sour grapes proverb and how it could be quoted in the Old Testament, but not anymore. Jesus did away with it. And by the way, the old covenant really was designed for a select group of people. If you wanted to reap the benefits of it, you needed to migrate over. You needed to proselyte, that is, be baptized into the family of Jews. You need to actually profess that you want to become a Jewish believer now, and you could become one in order to really be the people of God. And there were others who were not full-fledged Jews, but they were they were very devout people, very good moral people, and they were kind of closely associated with them too. But it was localized specifically. But under the new covenant, John 3:16 is just one of many verses that makes it clear it is absolutely universal, right? For everyone, Gentile. And if John 3:16 wasn't enough, God in Acts chapter 10 and 11 and other places, also in Acts chapter 9 through Paul as well, God made it very clear, get this message out to the entire world, to those Gentiles, those people you've been ignoring. Make sure they all hear it. It's for them. Under the old covenant, did that really happen? I mean, people were sharing to the people around them, but if you're looking for a big, clear-cut command to go, proclaim the praises, proclaim this message to the entire world, that you too can be a follower of God. I don't know of any specific Old Testament command, unless I'm missing it, where the Israelites were told to go out there. They were supposed to set an example. They were supposed to be an example, right? They were, in effect, a light to the world, to the Gentiles, stuff like that. But as far as a command to go out there and evangelize the world, I don't see it until we get to the new covenant, until we get to the day of Pentecost, and just before that, just before Jesus ascends into heaven, he makes it clear, like, once the Holy Spirit comes, you get out there, spread the message to the world. So, that's a reminder that I hope it makes some sense to you. Any questions or comments about that, or thoughts?
I was just going to say one other thing. I don't know that it fits your parable, but
That's fine.
isn't the fact that they actually couldn't, so many sins and rules that they couldn't actually live up to that? I mean, there was absolutely no way they
Absolutely
could
right.
absolutely be that.
Even if they were not held guilty of any sort of original sin, they were held to a standard that they really could not fully keep either. I would agree. Unless you were thinking of the infant that was, died at birth. Okay, how many sins did that baby commit? Didn't live long enough to commit any sins. But if what I understand is true, that infant would be in big trouble if it weren't for Jesus and what he did, if I understand Romans 5 properly. Maybe I don't. That's why I'm qualifying that, because Romans 5 is not an easy passage to just read and, I got this. I've struggled with it for some time, and I still don't have a strong grasp on it, but I really think that's what it's teaching. So, is there a question over here? Just one of those judgmental clearing of the throat. So, okay. I don't know what to make of that, but I hope it's not bad. You got a comment? All right. Just checking. I don't want to leave anyone out here, guys. You mean a lot to me, so. All right, well, let's get back into Jeremiah, wrap up this wonderful chapter that I really obviously tried to live in for a while because it's so good, but we can't stay here forever. There's more. Behold, days are coming. What does that mean again? When he says, behold, the days are coming, what does that signify or hint at? Messianic, yes, messianic. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when the city will be rebuilt for the Lord, from the tower of Hananel to the corner gate. The measuring line will go out farther, straight ahead to the hill Gareb, Then it will turn to Goa, and the whole valley of dead bodies, and of the ashes, and all the fields as far as the brook Kidron, to the corner of the horse gate toward the east, shall be holy to the Lord. It will not be plucked up or overthrown anymore forever. Forever. So, days are coming. Messianic reference again. Well, what is this messianic reference? The city will be rebuilt where? From the Tower of Hananel, the corner gate. This would be the northeast. And then the corner gate northwest. So the northeast and northwest corners of Jerusalem are being referred to there in verse 38. Then when you get to 39, the word Gareb, we don't know exactly where it is, but the word is a word that actually means to itch. Or it could be a word that hints at leprosy. I don't know if you have a footnote there, but the idea of the itching people would probably be the people with forms of leprosy or various skin diseases. By the way, at that time, translations that say leprosy, I don't think they're completely wrong, but my understanding is that the Hebrew word is more generic than that it could refer to various types of skin diseases. And I've heard someone say that it was probably a disease known as scale disease, but I don't actually know what that disease is, so I don't want to over-speculate, but it may be a little more generic than just the traditional leprosy that we're aware of. So, but anyway, it seems to hint at a place that we don't know exactly where it was, but Gareb would probably be referring to a place where lepers would be, people with leprosy, and that Goa is an unknown location, okay? So we got that. We got the northeast, northwest. We got those covered. We got the place where the lepers would be. Verse 40 says that the new bound, well, let's see, what does it say, verse 40? In the whole valley of dead bodies and of ashes, the brook Kidron, the horse gate, holy to the Lord. What's contradictory? What's oxymoronic, if that's even a word, about verse 40? Given what you know about God, how is it a problem to talk about these places being holy to the Lord?
Oh yeah, a dead body was
Yeah.
contrary to.
If
You're not
I
allowed to touch it. You'd be defiled.
yes, you'd be unclean. If I told you guys, listen, I got us a great deal on a place to expand our congregation. It's going to be wonderful. It's more space. People can see it from miles around. It's only a few miles out. It's right over there at the dump. Big old hill. We could use the pigeons to send messages to people. Everyone could see us, could smell us from miles around. I mean, we would reach out to the world. What problems would we have? Well, you kind of realize, like, you can't take a dump and make it this beautiful attraction to the world. It's a dump. It's where people put their garbage, and we're not looking for that, are we? Well, it's the same kind of idea, like, oh yeah, the place where we dump waste and where we dump our dead bodies and stuff like that, all that, holy to the Lord. Doesn't make much sense, right? Let's stop and think about that for a minute. So we've got big boundaries as far as they were familiar with. Then we've got the place where the lepers would be and the people who had leprosy. And then we have the place where dead bodies and perhaps other waste and filth was also dumped. And God says all of this is going to be holy to the Lord. Now, if you're thinking about a physical location, you might be scratching your head a little bit, kind of wondering, okay, the new parameters is kind of interesting. Why is it going to be built this way? I guess it's going to be bigger and it's going to be great. But this is yet another reason why I think he's specifically not talking about a physical location. Just like when I get to the latter part of the book of Ezekiel, the big, long, many chapters long explanation of the new temple and what it's going to be like, I really don't think he's talking about the physical temple. I think he's allegorically speaking of because that new one just dwarfs the old one, reaches out to areas that used to be for Gentiles only, or for bad stuff only. And I think he's deliberately doing the same thing here. You don't build a city, a holy city, over the dead bodies and encompass that and just pretend that it's all holy now. You don't deliberately say, oh yeah, we're going to include the lepers into this city. It's just going to be this beautiful, holy city to God. That's countercultural. That is against the way God had taught them at this time. That's an unclean city, and yet he's making it all clean somehow. Also notice in this city, what does he say about the new temple being built? What does he say about it? Do you see the temple there? I don't see it. I don't see it. So you got a few problems here. Why would he be building a physical city and yet not refer to the temple, the crown jewel, if you will, of Jerusalem, the place that represented not all of God's presence, but, in a very special way, their worship of God. And then why would you not mention the proper places to dispose of the waste? Because the places that you did have before that were all for waste and sickness and quarantine and stuff have now been made holy to God, and you've got nothing left to dispose of the waste. You don't do that if you're building a real city, but if you're talking about a spiritual city, if you're talking about a kingdom that's not of this world, then you can do that, right? You can take something that had once been considered, oh, that's only for filthy people. Gentiles, they're for hellfire. They're lepers, just get away. They are unclean. We cannot touch unclean things or whatever. But all of a sudden, God can come and say, no. They're all clean now. All of them. But wait, where's the temple? Yes, there they are. That's my temple. It's all there. Every bit of it. What do we do with the waste? There is no waste anymore. Because Christ, my son's sacrifice, paid for all of it. It's not unclean anymore. It's all holy to me now. We don't need to talk about that. Because we're not talking about a physical city anymore. We're talking about something so much bigger than that. I really think that's, and I mean, not just because of what he says, behold, the days are coming, but because of every other thing we've been discussing up to this point in Jeremiah 31. I think this is yet another really cool picture if you examine it and just stew on it, just meditate on it like God wants us to do. This is just another reminder of how great God's kingdom on earth is, how wonderful it is. I don't think he ever wanted us to get hung up on physical buildings. He wanted us to think about something bigger. And to them it would probably make more sense because they would realize, well, hold on, how can we not have places for the waste and the dead and the lepers and stuff? How is that going to work out? I don't know. God's going to do something, I guess. I don't know what it is. But we have the benefit of the new covenant to know what that is. So that wraps up where we are in Jeremiah 31. Only 3 or 4 weeks in that. That was a long time. Should pick up the pace. But any questions before we move to the 32nd chapter of Jeremiah? Would anyone here say that Jeremiah 31 is your favorite chapter so far in Jeremiah? Anyone give me a nod? No? Maybe. It's got to be mine. I like some of that positive stuff. I'm not like you guys, like Jeremiah getting beat down yet again and suffering. You guys are kind of sadistic sometimes. I'm sorry, but give the guy a break. He's going through so much. It's nice to be that.
32. Doesn't look good for Jeremiah.
Jeremiah chapter 32. Again, this is in a section where we're guessing it's the spring of 587, spring to summer, something like that. We talk about the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. That's true, but it started in 587. So some things will say 587 because it's a siege that took place for months, where Nebuchadnezzar came. And one of the things that I didn't realize until recently, you've got, and by the way, I don't know what this is, snakes and spiders. It's kind of sinister, it's kind of evil. If you've got if you've got the city of Jerusalem, and we'll just do a crude thing here, if you've got the city of Jerusalem, I believe it's roughly in this area or whatever, and you've got Nebuchadnezzar coming up where he's coming, and you got Egypt down here, the Nile Delta, stuff like that, Red Sea. If you have some of that stuff, so the siege was not just a one and done kind of thing. Nebuchadnezzar did come over and lay siege for a while, but then there were other little skirmishes, little fights of leftovers from Egyptian's army sneaking on up, making their way up. And so for a time, Jeremiah was there when Nebuchadnezzar was laying siege, but then he quit the siege for a month or so, came down and fought off the Egyptian army. So during that period of 587, spring to summer right in there is a siege going on in Jerusalem, but then it lulls down. It slows down for a little bit because Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians have to break from the siege and go deal with an Egyptian threat, an uprising that they're coming up trying to attack. So they deal with that, and then when they're done with that, they're going to turn right back around and go up and finish the siege, which will go until about 586, and that's when it'll be done. So the speculation of where we are here is that we are somewhere perhaps in the midst of the summertime of 587 BC, during the time when there was that little lull in the siege. So everyone could see the siege is upon us, it's happening, but there were some times where it was really bad, and there were some times where, okay, they haven't completely gone away, but they've really died down a bit, but they're probably coming back. It was very clear that was going to happen. So an attacking Egyptian army in the south, and then the siege began again. You'll read about this in Jeremiah 37, if you want a reference for that. A lot of people think that this chapter follows those events that we see in chapter 37, that this goes kind of hand in hand with that. In that chapter, you're going to find that Jeremiah is arrested for trying to leave Jerusalem during that little lull in the siege. During that little break, he's arrested because he tries to leave. Why did he try to leave? Well, that's what God's been telling him all along, you know. So he's arrested for that. So just because he's imprisoned here, a lot of times people think that it's the same time, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't mean that just because he was imprisoned here that therefore it's talking about that time. It says here that he's in prison because of his message. It's entirely possible that he was in prison more than one occasion. And knowing Jeremiah, highly likely he's been run down more than one occasion. So this may not follow that chronology exactly. That's just some speculation that's worth pointing out. So I wanted you guys to be aware of that. But that's where we are, and I'll get into these verses real quick. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord the 10th year of Zedekiah king of Judah, which was the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. Now at that time the army of the king of Babylon was besieging Jerusalem, and Jeremiah the prophet was shut up in the court of the guard, which was in the house of the king of Judah, because Zedekiah king of Judah had shut him up, saying, "Why do you prophesy, saying, Thus says the Lord, Behold, I am about to give this city into the hand of the king of Babylon, and he will take it. And Zedekiah king of Judah will not escape out of the hand of the Chaldeans," same as the Babylonians, "but he will surely be given into the hand of the king of Babylon. And he will speak with him face to face, and see him eye to eye, and he will take Zedekiah to Babylon, and he will be there until I visit him, declares the Lord. If you fight against the Chaldeans, you will not succeed." So Jeremiah is in prison, but it's clearly because of his message, because of what he had been saying. That is why he is in prison. It doesn't say here that it's because he tried to run or that he tried to leave during a break in the siege. So this may not be the same timeline as Jeremiah 37, but it might be. So it's worth mentioning. And Jeremiah said, "The word of the Lord came to me, saying, Behold, Hananel, son of Shallum, your uncle, is coming to you, saying, Buy for yourself my field, which is at Anathoth, for you have the right of redemption to buy it." Then Hananel, my uncle's son, came to me in the court of the guard, according to the word of the Lord, and said to me, "Buy my field, please, that is at Anathoth, which is in the land of Benjamin. For you have the right of possession, and the redemption is yours. Buy it for yourself." Then I knew that this was the word of the Lord. And I bought the field, which was at Anathoth, from Hanamel, my uncle's son, and I weighed out the silver for him, 17 shekels of silver. I signed and sealed the deed, and called in witnesses, and weighed out the silver on scales. So, we have a business transaction. Funny timing for that, don't you think? Hey, you want to buy some stuff, some land? I got some land. It's real cheap right now. Yeah, I wonder why. Wonder why. First of all, we're dealing with a priestly town. How do they have land? I thought the priests and those helpers of the priests, the Levites, they didn't get their own tribal allotment of land, correct? The Levites did not get their own tribal. That's true. They did not get their own allotment of a land, a large tribe like the rest did. They were supported. However, in Joshua 21:19, as well as Joshua 21:41 and Numbers 35 verses 2 through 9, we read about priests having special city allotments. The priests had 13 of them, and the Levites had 48 of them, special cities. So there was, in fact, land allocated to the priests and to the Levites. It just was not a huge whole tribe like that. It was much, much smaller place for them to dwell. So these cities, because they were smaller, and remember, what was the rule for the tribes? If you wanted to sell your land, who did you have to sell to?
Relative.
You're right, people who were in the same tribal family as you. Because you can't have land from Benjamin getting shipped off over to somebody from Gad or whatever, right? Then the tribes would break down really quickly because they'd say, no, I'm from Gad and this is my land here in Benjamin, and we'd have all this mess. So they had to parse it out by major family divisions. So Jeremiah is approached by his uncle's son. Who's that? Cousin, yeah, right. That'd be your cousin, if I'm not mistaken. Your uncle's son, your cousin, I think. So he's approached by his cousin. Why would he be approached? Well, probably a very limited amount of options of people who can buy this land. This is land of the priests. Well, how many of those we got? Not a ton. So he comes to Jeremiah because he's one of the few that actually has the right to purchase this land because it's got to stay within the tribe of the priests. Very slim pickings there. Worst possible time. I mean, you talk about a bad real estate move. This would be it right here. This would be how to not to become a millionaire right here. He was approached by his cousin at the worst possible time in the middle of the siege. What's going to happen in the siege? They're going to lose all the land. It's all going to be taken away from them anyway. Probably, it's entirely possible that this particular land that he's trying to sell is already under Babylonian control. It may have already, in fact, been seized. But Jeremiah was told, nope, buy it. The Lord says, buy it. In other words, put your money where your mouth is. You know, you've been saying these wonderful things in chapter 1. Demonstrate it by purchasing this land. Now, this is something that Jeremiah will do, but later on we're going to see he doesn't fully grasp what he's doing. At least not yet. But he does buy it. It's pretty cool, and this is probably where we'll end up, but what's the lesson, by the way? What is the reason, we're going to find out later, but you can probably tell now. What is the reason why God would tell him that he wants him to buy property in a place that's about to be taken over by Babylon?
They'll be back.
They will be, I'll be back. Yes. You're coming back. This is a way of reminding, like, yeah, I had to punish you. Your deeds deserved it. We couldn't just let this go. We couldn't just sweep it under the rug. But within about 70 years or so, I promised you, I'll bring you back. So you buy it. Hold on to it. It's a symbol to say, hey, the very prophet that was preaching all this doom and destruction is buying land in a public transaction for us to see. So,
Get a good price.
yeah, and it's a great price.
70 ounces.
A good deal. It gives us a little bit of insight into how they would do transactions and stuff too, weighing out the amount of silver and stuff like that. But to me, it's just a reminder of how God will call things out ahead of time just to remind us that he's in control. And one of my, I say favorite, but not favorite because I enjoy doing it, but it's favorite because I constantly am brought back to it, is just remember the things that God has said ahead of time. Remember those and then see them actually come to fruition. Yeah.
So Jeremiah doing that, he showed faith in God's promise.
He sure did. He absolutely did. He believed what God was going to do, and but what's interesting to me, and we haven't gotten there yet, but he's going to pray a prayer to God that in a sense says, God, why are you having me buy this land exactly? What is the reason? And that's a great prayer. We're going to spend time on that. But he did it anyway. He trusted God anyway, even though he fully didn't understand why he had to do it. That's what makes it even greater faith. You may not understand why you need to do what you need to do, but Jeremiah did it first, ask questions later. And I like that, obey first, then ask your questions. Figure out, God, why did you want me to do that anyway? I mean, I'm doing it, I've already done it, but I'm just curious why, maybe he'll tell you, maybe he won't. Maybe he'll make it clear to you. But God says so many things about humanity that are proven true, and it's not often positive. Oh, well, there are a lot of positives, but man, so many of them are negatives, right? So many of them are the very things about how man decays, how they fall apart if they reject God. Ravi Zacharias made a pretty good impact when he wrote a book called Can Man Live Without God? And I like that book. I think the title says it pretty well. His basic premise was, what happens to mankind if you really and truly pull God out of the equation? You watch him self-destruct. You watch him try to enforce laws without any baseline reason for morality in the first place. There's no reason to even have laws. There's no reason to value life. There's just no good logical reason for it. And you watch, even though we don't say it with our mouths, you watch people live that way and they decay, they deteriorate, and it leads to things. This chart is a great example. You might have spotted this on the internet. This talks about the dictators who killed the most people, at least in relatively recent history. Each drop is supposed to represent 1 million people that were murdered by a dictator. Now, a couple of fascinating things here. Okay, some people are going to debate Adolf Hitler and say, listen, he was Catholic. He said he was Catholic. Well, my understanding is, yeah, he made a claim one time to be Catholic, and then another time I believe he made a claim that he wasn't religious at all. I would argue, given the little bit I know about his life, he did not live like any sort of Christian or any follower of Christ. He didn't do anything consistent with what Scripture says. And you certainly can't say that he loved the Jews either, right? So, I mean, you've got a mountain of evidence to explain that this guy was not really being a Christian at all. Not thinking about the fact that Jesus was a Jew too. Let's focus on that for a minute, right? But even if you want to get picky about that, look at his drops compared to this guy's. Now another thing, I read to me that was a very convincing article about Joseph Stalin that actually said the numbers have been very convoluted. It's been very hard to dig into it. But if you really want a more realistic number of how many people this guy killed, they argued for almost the same amount as Mao Zedong. This says 23 million, which is a more conservative, more common estimate. They said probably 60 million would be more accurate for Joseph Stalin. Ravi Zacharias tells some stories about this guy Stalin and just how evil that dictator was, how godless that man was. He was in it for himself, and that's it. He had no God in his mind to be held accountable to. And Ravi Zacharias tells this story about that man when somebody asked him, hey, why are you so cruel to your people? And he said just at that moment there was a chicken not far off. And Stalin walked over and grabbed this chicken and proceeded to rip every single feather out of this chicken until it had no feathers left. It was this pitiful, disgusting looking creature basically. And he threw it down and he started walking. And the other guy watched. The chicken just followed him around. And he turned to this other guy and he said, that's why I'm cruel to people. Because if you take everything that they have, they will depend on you for their life. They will give you everything. They will serve you forever. That was his mentality. So if you want to talk about people who murder, who do terrible atrocities and stuff like that, sure, a lot of people have done a lot of things in the name of religions and in the name of Christianity, sadly. Some terrible things have been done. But if you want to stack up numbers of people who have died, you're going to look at something that is very hideous. But you know what's... Yes, this is hideous, but you know what else it tells us? It tells us something that God has already said a long, long, long time ago. When you live without Him, there's no limit to the amount of moral decay that you will see. Go to Romans 1. What happens? People start worshiping things in the creation rather than the Creator. They exchange the truth for deliberate lies. They start becoming homosexuals. You go right on down the list of things that happen, and it is what happens. Here again, we've got people who, no regard for human life, you probably don't want to think of.
Ban religion.
Ban lots of religion.
Won't they
Good
ban
point.
religion?
You probably don't want to think about the amount of sexual sins associated with all of those murders too. The amount of mass, I was just reading a book about the Japanese and some of their conquests or whatever in World War II, but the amount of rape that took place in the midst of the massacres and stuff like that, all of this goes together, and it's exactly what God said would happen. It's exactly what God says. So rather than getting mad at God about it, why not realize, whoa, God knew exactly what he's talking about, and we're going on close to 2,000 years ago. He wrote it down so that we would be very aware of what happens when we reject him, and guess what? It does. And in relatively recent history, we can see it's what happens. It's just a reminder that even those negative things, it's true. So what does God want us to do? I think he wants us to put our money where our mouth is. I think he wants us to actually take steps that show, listen, I believe that God is telling the truth, and I believe that we are in trouble without him. We need to do something. We can't just go about life like, oh, it's just every other day and I'll live forever. No, not here you won't. Not here you won't. Any questions? We're about over time, so comments, thoughts? Let's pray.